So now it is my pleasure, to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jonathan Schooler. Dr. Schooler received his Bachelor of Science degree in psychology from Hamilton College, a small liberal arts college in upstate New York. We discussed last night out in the middle of the snow belt. And he got his MS and his PhD degrees from the University of Washington in psychology in 1984 and 1987, respectively. After graduation, Dr. Schooler took a position in the University of Pittsburgh as an assistant professor, where he stayed through promotion to full professor in 2004. In that same year, he took a position as Canada Research Chair in Social Cognitive Science at the University of British Columbia, where he stayed until moving to his current location at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where my friends are fond of saying it's the paradise, right? So welcome to another day in paradise. My friend who moved to Santa Barbara used to send me nasty little emails while I was still in Buffalo, New York. Anyway, Dr. Schooler's research focuses on consciousness, memory, the relationship between language and thought, problem solving, and decision making. He's particularly interested in exploring phenomena that intersect between the empirical and the philosophical. Dr. Schooler has authored more than 100 scientific publications and edited with J.C. Cohen Scientific Approaches to Consciousness. His research has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, the Office of Educational Research, the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and the Canadian Institute for Health Research, among others. His teaching and scholarship has been recognized by numerous awards, including the Lilly Foundation Teaching Fellowship, the Usher Fellowship from the Exploratory Science and Museum. Is that in Pittsburgh?
No, that's in San Francisco.
Oh, in San Francisco. An Ocamel Scholar Award from the Positive Psychology Network, in addition to occupying, as I said before, the Canada Research Chair at the University of British Columbia. So we're fortunate to have Dr. Schooler with us today. The title of his talk is Mind Wandering and Meta-Awareness, Reconsidering the Mind from the Inside Out. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schooler. Getting caught up. Goodness.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure and honor to speak with you all today. I want to do a couple things today that are a little unusual. First off, I'm going to be talking about mind wandering, and although I have yet to test this, I have a hypothesis that people mind wander during talks. And I also have another hypothesis, which is that if people ask questions, somehow the monotony of my voice is reduced, and it brings people back. So I want to save some questions for the end, but I also want to encourage you to ask questions during the talk. And you can think of that as sort of as a favor to your colleagues, bringing them back from their mind-wandering musings, although that may not be a favor now that I think about it. But in any case. The second thing is I'm going to mostly be focusing on mind-wandering and meta-awareness, but I'm also, at the very end of this talk, going to go completely off the deep end and talk about some sort of more speculative considerations about the nature of mind and its relationship to a reality. So brace yourselves. There's going to be I'm really going to go sort of far out there towards the end, but I promise to stay a little closer to home for most of the talk. Okay, so with no further ado, let's begin here. So I want to consider several problems with this sort of the standard approach to mind, and the basic argument is that typically when people think about the mind, they take an external perspective to it. There's a third-person perspective that is sort of the way that we think about the mind. We think about other people's minds. We don't really imagine it from our own internal first-person perspective. And I want to argue that this third-person perspective to the mind has led to a number of kinds of problems, and these problems have been identified by David Chalmers The first kind of problems, Chalmers talks about the easy and the hard problems of consciousness. And so these lead to what I want to argue are easy and hard problems with thinking about the mind. The easy problems involve the way in which this third-person perspective has led us to sort of overlook internal states and measures. That by and large, when we think about the mind, we tend not to focus as much on the internal states and measures. And I'll try to illustrate that in a moment. And then the hard problem is that even when we consider all the neural correlates, all the observations that we could have about consciousness, this will still not explain the arising of subjective experience. And so there is this fundamental core problem, the one that I'll return to at the end of this talk, about what can we say about how it is that we have an experience at all, as opposed to just information processing. But the majority of my talk is going to focus on the easier problems. And so let me move there. What I want to say is one of the key problems that arises from this third-person perspective, one of them has been this sort of assumption that attention is driven by endogenous cues. So there's been a tremendous amount of research on attention, and the vast majority of the research on attention has focused on what happens when I shift attention from over here to over there, if I'm focusing here. So it's basically visual attention, and visual attention as focused on external endogenous cues. Surprisingly little research in the attentional domain has focused on how attention shifts back and forth, not from one external object to another external object, but instead from the external world to the internal trains of thoughts and back and forth, this internal-external shift of attention, very largely overlooked relative to all the research that's been focusing on one endogenous cue versus another. There was, and I do want to pay homage to a few individuals who have been studying daydreaming, Jerome Singer, Giambra, Klinger, Antrobus, but by and large, this issue of the shifts of attention to internal trains of thought was largely overlooked in mainstream psychology. You didn't find it in the major journals, Psych Science, you wouldn't have found it there. You wouldn't see it even mentioned in most intro textbooks or even in cognitive psychology textbooks. So there really was a major overlooking of this fundamental and important area in which attention drifts. A second consequence of our ignoring the first-person perspective has been a general disdain for or ignoring of introspection as a source of empirical evidence. Of course, psychology started off on the introspective foot and then sort of went awry there, and it's really taken a long time to consider introspective evidence. It's usually self-reports and individuals' characterizations of their own mental states is oftentimes considered with a good deal of skepticism. I think part of the problem here comes from what Charles Schreiber and I have referred to as the paradox of introspection. And this is elegantly sort of drawn out by some of the discussions that William James had about introspection long ago. On the one hand, there's a fundamental way in which experience is self-evident, right? As Brentano said, no one can doubt whether the psychic condition he apprehends is in himself be and be so as he apprehends it. So if I'm hallucinating a giant pink elephant hovering over the audience here, even though there is no giant pink elephant there, still my experience is of a giant pink elephant. So there's a sense in which my experience is what it is just by virtue of my having it. And even if it has no bearing on reality, if I have it, then there's a certain sort of self-evidence to it. Similarly, James said, introspective observation is what we have to rely on first, foremost, and always. So there is this sort of fundamental sense in which experience is incontrovertible. On the other hand, our ability to characterize our experience to ourselves is often very suspect. So again, Um, Comte said, this is again quoted in James, the thinker cannot divide himself into two, of whom one reasons whilst the other observes his reason. And James, in his inimitable way, put it this way: the attempt at introspective analysis in these cases is in fact like seizing a spinning top to catch its motion, or trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. So on the one hand, there's a sense in which we have experience that's incontrovertible, and on the other hand, our ability to describe that experience, to communicate it, to capture it, is really quite problematic. So how do we reconcile? This is the paradox. How do we reconcile these two seemingly conflicting observations? And to do that, I'd like to introduce a distinction that I've been playing with now for a number of years that involves different levels of consciousness. Typically, when we talk about consciousness, we talk about things either are conscious or they're not, or we might say that they're sort of marginally conscious, but things are either it is or it isn't. And I think that's reasonable, and I'm certainly not challenging that basic claim that we have non-conscious processes that occur outside of awareness and experience, which is the contents of consciousness. But what I'd like to suggest is that there's a third level, which I've referred to as meta-awareness, which is or meta-consciousness. I use those two terms interchangeably, which is one's explicit understanding of their conscious experience. And this is related to a lot of other constructs, higher order consciousness, self-reflective consciousness, metacognitive awareness. But each one of those terms has its own sort of connotation, so I'll just stick with this particular usage for the time being, and illustrate it with an experience which I anticipate is familiar to many of you. How many of you have had the experience of reading a paper? If you're a faculty, it could be a paper that you're reviewing, or if you're a student, it could be a paper that you're reading for a class, and you're very motivated to pay attention to it. You know that you're responsible for all the material in the paper. Nevertheless, at some point during the reading process, you realize that although your eyes have continued to move across the page, that your mind has been fundamentally elsewhere. Is this an experience that people are familiar with? And if you look around the room, you'll see this sort of sheepish expressions of everybody, sort of a welcome to my world kind of a thing. Now, consider this particular experience, and even consider relative to not dissimilar experience of mind wandering while driving. Now, when you're driving, probably you've also had the experience of thinking about something unrelated to the road. Now, it's probably not the best idea in the world to drive and think about something unrelated. You're probably not going to be as good at handling emergency situations, but by and large, you can drive and competently and carry on a completely unrelated line of thought. So it's not an irrational behavior to engage in mind wandering while driving. It's a reasonable thing to do under some circumstances. It is impossible, and I think everyone would agree with this, it is impossible to mind wander about a completely unrelated topic and understand what it is that you're reading. We all know that you can't carry on two trains of thought simultaneously. So it is always and invariably self-defeating to mind wander while you are reading. If you are going to mind wander while you're reading, you should just stop reading and, think about whatever it is you want to read and then continue reading. To carry on reading is an entirely self-defeating thing. And you realize, as soon as you realize that you're doing it, you go, oh, geez, what was I doing? Where was I, right? And then you have to go back to where it was that you lost the train of thought. So there's this peculiar question, why do we do this? Why do we so often mind wander while we're reading, even though we know that this is entirely a self-defeating thing, right? Mind wandering during this lecture here, I might be having nothing to say here. It could be perfectly sensible under some circumstances to mind wander during a lecture or mind wander while driving, but mind wandering while reading is particularly peculiar because there's no justifiable reason ever to do it, and yet we do it all the time. Why? Well, the explanation for why we do it, the thing that I want to persuade you today, is the reason we do that is because we don't realize we're doing it. We have lost track of nothing less than the contents of our own thought. And so the basic argument is that we are experientially conscious continuously, but only intermittently do we become meta-aware. Only intermittently do we take stock of the contents of our mind and go, oh my gosh, there we go, there I go again, I was just mind wandering. So the idea is that we intermittently take stock of our minds, check in, and then realize what's going on there, and sometimes are rather surprised about that. So this is the third level, meta-awareness. It's the intermittent process of taking stock of the contents of thought. And so in the context of reading, non-consciousness might be the spreading activation to associated words. Experience would be what one is mind-wandering about. And then meta-awareness would be the intermittent recognition that one has been mind-wandering instead of reading. Okay, let me just pause there and see if there are any questions about that basic distinction. Okay. Okay, so with getting back to this issue of the paradox of introspection, the basic claim is that experience entails the ongoing, continuously changing state of the mind that an individual apprehends throughout his or her waking day. And that aspect of consciousness is unassailable. It simply is what it is. You have experience, and it just there's nothing more that can be said about it. At the same time, meta-awareness is one's explicit understanding of his or her conscious experience. And that's the basis of introspection and self-reports, and that is where the problems often arise in terms of this paradox of introspection. It is in the process of translating our experience to meta-awareness that the difficulties arise, because meta-awareness can often either neglect or misrepresent experience. So this leads to two different kinds of dissociations between meta-awareness and experience. Temporal dissociations, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on for the majority of today's talk, involve experience in the absence of meta-awareness. So the mind-wandering while reading, before you've noticed that you were mind-wandering, is a perfect example of a temporal dissociation. In addition, we have translation dissociations, and these are situations where one is asked to report on their internal state and they get it wrong. So where meta-awareness misrepresents or distorts the contents of experience, and this may occur in the process of reflection, where an individual embellishes, distorts, or neglects aspects of their experience. Some examples of this, some of the work that I've done on verbal overshadowing might be characterized in this way, where in the process of trying to describe a nonverbal experience, people distort it in ways. Another example that many of you may have encountered from one time or another is when a person shouts, "I'm not angry," right? Clearly, they are missing something about their own internal state in that situation. So there's some really interesting ways about thinking about translation dissociations in the context of emotion, where I think oftentimes people are not as, their meta-awareness is failing to fully capture their emotional state. All right, that's enough. Let me just talk about the methodological implications, and then we can talk about some actual data. So I want to argue that it's possible to distinguish between experience with versus without meta-awareness. And we've developed two paradigms to do this, to try to get a handle on those episodes of experience that are associated with meta-awareness and those that are not. One way that we do this is by taking two very common techniques for measuring people's internal states and combining them together. I call this the self-caught, probe-caught experience sampling methodology, which is not very catchy, but what are you going to do? So basically, what we can do is I can ask you in a self-report method to press a button every time you notice yourself mind-wandering, right? So if you just pressed a button and went, oh, I just did it again, I just caught myself mind-wandering, clearly you were meta-aware of it. That's what it means, right? You just pressed a button saying, I've noticed just now that my mind is wandering. But in addition to that, we can do something else. We can randomly probe people using what's known as experience sampling at random intervals and go, just now was your mind wandering. And the question is, how often can we catch people mind wandering before they've caught it themselves? And as you'll see, this happens all the time. We can regularly catch you before you've noticed your mind wandering yourself. And that then gives us an opportunity to see the episodes in which people notice it themselves, the episodes in which they didn't, and what are the different psychological properties associated with those two different situations. The second way, and you might be even more skeptical of this, is we just do experience sampling. So we probe people at random intervals, go, just now was your mind wandering? And then we ask them, did you know that your mind was wandering before we asked you? And you might think that this is a really kind of dodgy kind of thing to ask people. But as you'll see, it turns out that when we ask people that question, their answers systematically vary in ways that are very consistent with the notion that they really were aware when they said they were and not aware when they said they weren't. In fact, I'll even show you some rather striking fMRI data where we see really dramatic differences in activation as a function of whether or not people reported being aware or unaware of their mind wandering. Question, yeah?
Mind wandering always defined relative to some target state? In other words, could the participant's goal to wander, relax, chill out?
Yeah, that's a great question. The definitions that I use, daydreaming is actually the larger context. And daydreaming would be any situation in which the mind is being occupied by thoughts that are unrelated to the current situation. And then mind wandering is a particular kind of daydreaming. It's the kind of daydreaming in which you're actually engaging in some other specified task and still daydreaming. So if you're reading and daydreaming, that would be called mind wandering. If you're just sitting there in your chair without any other evident task, then that would just be daydreaming. Okay. The other methodological implication with respect to translation dissociations, I find myself in walking a very narrow line here, because on the one hand, I'm challenging introspection by saying that people's ability to report their own internal experiences may be subject to translation dissociations where they can omit or distort the contents of their own experience. And yet, as you'll see, the vast majority of the data that I'm going to be reporting to you involves introspective self-reports. So I recognize that I've kind of got myself wedged in there. But the argument that I want to use is that there is a justifiable way to use self-reports if you use this sort of logic of triangulation, which goes as follows. If self-reports consistently vary with behavioral and/or physiological measures in conceptually meaningful ways, then we can have more confidence that they are accurately reflecting experience. So in the case of mind wandering, if when people say they're mind wandering, we see that their performance is impaired relative to when they said they weren't, if we see that their memory for the material that they encountered is reduced, if we see that their errors are making more errors when they say that they were mind wandering when they weren't, if we see that their neurocognitive behavior is associated with more activation of areas that are associated with not processing external stimuli, if all of those things converge with the times when they say that they're mind wandering, then we can have increasing confidence that they really are mind wandering when they say that they were. So through the process of triangulation with neurocognitive and behavioral measures, we can have increased confidence in people's self-reports. Okay. I think at last we are ready to actually talk about some data. Here's the definition. So mind wandering is mental departures from the here and now in which individual attention is directed away from the task at hand, such as driving or reading. Experience sampling studies suggest that approximately at least 25% of waking hours is spent mind wandering. Daniel Gilbert had a paper that recently came out in Science where they had the largest experience sampling thing they had some iPhone software, and their estimate that there was nearly 50% of the time people were mind wandering. So it is a colossal amount of the time people are spent in this state, which it makes it so striking and perplexing that the field has gone so long without really doing sort of a head-on investigation of this study or ignoring mind wandering to a surprising degree. And of course, it's potentially extremely costly, where you can just imagine all the situations where if people are mind wandering when they should, an air traffic controller mind wandering is going to be a very, very bad situation. As I mentioned, it's up until recently been minimally studied. I think part of this has to do with this external perspective. It's an entirely internal state with few obvious exogenous markers. It relies entirely on self-reports. And so it's just not the kind of state that the field, which is so focused on third-person perspective, was willing to consider. So I think it's encouraging that things are turning around in this regard. All right, here we go. So the first study that we did on this involved mind wandering while reading. We gave people a definition of it. It turned out that that doesn't require, most everybody knows this experience rather well. We then had them read 5 chapters of War and Peace. One of our big discoveries is that undergraduates mind wander a lot while reading War and Peace. We then did the self-caught mind wandering with meta-awareness, where participants reported every time they noticed themselves mind wandering. And in addition, in the same paradigm, we did probe caught, in which every 2 to 4 minutes a screen would appear asking them, just now was your mind wandering? And then in addition, at the end of this study, we had a comprehension test. And this is another interesting aside, that tremendous amount of research, as you know, has been dedicated to the factors that contribute to comprehension accuracy. At the time of the study, not a single study had ever investigated the contribution of mind wandering to comprehension failures. And as you'll see, this turns out to be a really, really major source of comprehension deficits. So what do we find? We found that participants in about a 40-minute period caught themselves mind wandering about 5.3 times. And then we caught them, in addition, about 1.5 times, which may not seem like that much until you consider that that's about 13% of the time that they're in the study. So they're in a study in which they're supposed to be paying attention to the material. They're in a study in which they're supposed to tell us when they're mind wandering. And yet, nevertheless, despite both of these demands, still about 15% of the time, they're still mind wandering without realizing it. So it just sort of illustrates the magnitude. Yeah, Nelson, yeah.
I just wondered if the report of mind wandering can be self-protective, and in some cases they're actually trying to comprehend the material and not succeeding and reaching a blank, but it's not exactly the same as mind wandering. They might report that as mind wandering.
Yeah, so one possibility, and we've given this some thought, is that it's actually going the other way around. It's not that a mind wandering is leading to comprehension failure, but that a comprehension failure is either leading to mind wandering or else just being characterized as mind wandering. And several bits of evidence argue against that as being the full explanation for what's going on. For example, we've had people reading incredibly simple children's material, the kind of material that would that a third grader would be able to understand, and we still get high incidences of mind wandering, and we also have done a paradigm where the text turns to gibberish, and the question is, how long will they continue to advance the text before they notice that what they're reading makes absolutely no sense whatsoever? And in this paradigm, they regularly, even though this is material that they completely should be able to understand, will advance the text for quite a while before noticing that the text is gibberish. And if we probe them at those times when they're doing that and ask them, was your mind wandering, they go yeah. So it does seem like, although there may well be, one other thing is we also find correlations between mind wandering in text and mind wandering in material that has no semantic content whatsoever. So it does seem that while there may be bidirectionality here, that many of the lapses entail mind wandering leading to comprehension failures. Yes?
In this study here, where you're dealing with a literary text, how do you make the distinction between mind wandering and the mental act of going from the written text to actually completing it, particularly in the age of cinema, where we do much more visualization, and so you have to draw a distinction, I think, somewhere between mind wandering and actually being involved in the text that's going on.
Right, sort of elaborating. Yeah, that's a great question. We define mind wandering as being when you're thinking about things entirely unrelated to the text. We also asked participants what they were mind wandering about, and the vast majority of the time, their mind wandering had nothing to do with the text. It was, thinking about things that they're going to do with their friends and so on. But it is a very interesting question about this idea of elaboration that while I'm hoping that you're not thinking about lunch as I'm talking to you now, if you're generating questions such as the one that you just asked, that's great, right? So there's a certain level of elaboration which is very useful, and I think that's sort of one of the skills is allowing the mind to drift a little bit, but not so far as to be completely away from the situation at hand. Okay, so we then looked at the correlation between comprehension and mind wandering, and we looked at this both with respect to self-caught and the probe-caught measures. And you might take a moment and think about how you might expect those two different measures to correlate with comprehension. Well, when we look at the probe-catch ratio, this is basically the mind-wandering episodes that occurred without meta-awareness, where we caught them before they caught themselves. A striking negative 0.51 correlation between how often we caught them mind-wandering and how well they did on that final comprehension test. In contrast, when they caught themselves, there was actually no correlation. So really sort of dramatically demonstrating the power of meta-awareness. This makes some sense. If you're catching yourself mind-wandering, you can engage in repair. You can correct. You can engage in the kind of self-regulative processes that will enable you to correct for the problems of mind-wandering. But if you don't notice it, then you're sort of coming in and out, and you never noticed you were gone. So both demonstrate these combination of these two findings illustrate both the importance of mind wandering and also the importance of meta-awareness. Okay, so in conclusion, from this study, people regularly mind wander while reading. Mind wandering is associated with substantial performance costs. Probe-caught mind wandering is correlated with comprehension failures. People regularly lack meta-awareness of mind wandering. Over 13% of the time, they were caught mind wandering before they noticed it themselves. And meta-awareness appears to modulate the impact. Self-caught mind wandering was not correlated with comprehension performance. Okay, so one of the key claims here is that the self-caught and probe-caught paradigm differentially taps the meta-awareness of mind wandering. And so we can ask that makes a prediction then, which is that if we could knock out meta-awareness, we should differentially affect these two measures. So this is a paper done with Michael Sayed and Eric Reichel that was reported in Psychological Science. And the basic premise here is that self-caught mind wandering involves episodes that have reached meta-awareness. Probe-caught mind wandering involves episodes that have not reached meta-awareness. So the prediction is that manipulation, as I said, that reduces meta-awareness should alter the ratio of self-caught to probe-caught mind wandering. Okay, so how can we knock out meta-awareness? Well, we availed ourselves of a technique that many of you have probably availed yourself of from time to time, and perhaps we can all avail ourselves of it later on at the reception, which is to reduce meta-awareness through the simple process of consuming alcohol. Alcohol is known to reduce self-awareness, and that may be one of the reasons why individuals find it so pleasant. And so our hypothesis was, if that were the case, that we might also reduce meta-awareness. If people had consumed alcohol, that they might be less likely to notice that their minds had wandered, and that should then lead to differential measurements with respect to the self-caught and probe-caught measures. So we basically replicated the previous study, but we got half the participants drunk. Actually, all of the participants consumed a beverage that they believed to be alcohol. Michael Sayed has done a lot of work with placebo, so everyone thought that they had consumed alcohol. It was like a tonic, and it had a little bit of alcohol on the rim to give it a bit of a smell of it. So all the participants believed that they were intoxicated, and then they participated in this reading paradigm where they were doing self-caught and probe-caught. So what we found is that with respect to what do we have? The self-caught, we have participants were marginally, although not statistically significantly, less likely to report mind wandering when they were intoxicated relative to when they were sober. So they were reporting less, although not significantly less mind-wandering episodes when drunk. At the same time, when we looked at the actual frequency of these episodes, they were twice as likely to be caught by the probe mind-wandering when they were intoxicated relative to not. So these individuals, on the one hand, are twice as likely to actually be mind-wandering, and yet they're numerically less likely to notice it. And this perhaps offers further insights into why alcohol may be so problematic for situations such as driving, because here individuals are really not present. They are much more likely to be entirely distracted, and yet they are lacking the metacognitive aware appreciation of that fact. And it is also, of course, illustrates the, or helps to further validate the value of the self-caught, probe-caught distinction. All right. Let's talk about some of the neural correlates now of mind wandering. So again, as I mentioned before, our approach here is to triangulate between self-reports, behavioral and neurocognitive measures in order to discern fluctuations of attention between external tasks and the internal source of mind wandering. And we also wanted to further document this mind wandering phenomena. All right, so the way that we did this is in a study conducted with Kalina Christoph, and this was presented in recently, or a little bit less recently, in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. In this study, we were looking into an area of the brain that has been associated, known as the default network, which has been associated in an interesting way with not giving anything for people to do. So Marcus Rakel discovered that when you have people in the scanner and you give them no activity to engage in, there are actually regions of the brain that are more active when they have nothing to do than when they have something to do. And this, at first, was a real mystery. Why would the brain be active when it wasn't doing anything? Some of the areas that that are associated with this network include the medial prefrontal cortex, the precuneus, and the posterior lateral parietal cortex. One intriguing interpretation is that the default network may be associated with stimulus-independent thought, that the reason why the brain is so active when you give people nothing to do is because the mind is actually very active when you give people nothing to do. When you don't give them anything to do, they're actually daydreaming. And so this is a reasonable interpretation of that pattern. So our approach then was to assess mind wandering using experience sampling in the scanner. So we basically did a procedure similar to the one that I described before. In this case, we used a paradigm known as the SART. Let me see if I have it. The SART is a simple go, no-go paradigm, in which you basically have people pressing a button every time they see a number, unless it's the number 3, and they have to withhold a response to the number 3. But the number 3 is very rare. So they're basically just sitting there in this incredibly tedious task of pressing and pressing and pressing and pressing. And if you're mind wandering and the 3 comes along, then you'll press for the 3 as well. So the nice thing about the SART is that it also has a behavioral measure of mind wandering, which is when people press for the target when they should have done a no-go response. So we can then, in this study, we could look at experience probes in which individuals reported being on versus off task, and then look at the pattern of activation prior to episodes in which individuals reported being on task versus off task, and also prior to episodes in which people made a correct response versus an incorrect response. And you'd expect, again, through this sort of principle of triangulation, that individuals should show similar patterns of activation when they report being off task and when they report making errors. In addition, we use the technique that I mentioned before of asking people after we caught them mind wandering whether or not they were aware of their mind wandering, and getting ahead of myself. And basically, the idea is that if there's a meaningful distinction between mind wandering with meta-awareness versus without, then we should also see differences in the pattern of brain activation when people report being aware versus unaware of their mind wandering. Okay, so what did we find? The first thing that we found is if you look at the areas with the green arrows are areas that were associated with greater degrees of default activation. The top panel there involves a subtraction between when individuals reported being off task versus on task. So any area that's lit up here is an area that was more active when people were off task versus on task. And you see that there were a number of regions of the default network that were more active when people were off task than when they were on task. In addition, when we look at areas of associated with errors, we similarly find greater activation of the default network when individuals were off task versus on task, which is consistent with this notion that the default network is associated with daydreaming and stimulus-independent thought. Interestingly, and I won't go into this too much right now, but we also found areas of the executive network being more active when individuals were mind-wandering than when they were on task, including the dorsal ACC and the bilateral DLPFC. And this was a little bit unexpected because typically what you find is when the default network comes on, the executive network comes off, that they sort of work in an anti-correlated manner. But it seems that mind-wandering may be one of these situations where these two regions may be able to sort of work more collaboratively. When people, keep in mind that the task here was a very non-demanding task. So when individuals are just pressing a button, when they see a number, that's not very demanding. So there's not a lot of executive demands in engaging in this task. In contrast, when you're mind-wandering, you can be engaging in planning and imagining the future and engaging in some more resource-demanding kinds of thought processes. So this may be a situation where these two regions actually work at the same time. Okay. Also, we compared the difference between on-task versus off-task off-task activation as a function of whether or not individuals were meta-aware. The top panel there involves mind-wandering without meta-awareness. So this is a subtraction between off-task without meta-awareness and on-task. And you can see quite a lot of differences between the two in that subtraction. In the bottom panel is when people were mind-wandering with meta-awareness. What you can see is much less of a difference between on-task and off-task when people report being meta-aware of the fact that they're off-task. In other words, when people are mind-wandering without meta-awareness, the difference in their brain activity relative to being on-task is much more profound than when people are mind-wandering with meta-awareness. Mind-wandering with meta-awareness is almost sort of a midway between being entirely off-task and being on task. Okay, so conclusions from this study, we found evidence that the default network is activated during mind wandering. We also found evidence that the executive network is also active, which suggests that mind wandering may be resource demanding and involving the consideration of distant goals. And we also found evidence for the importance of meta-awareness. A difference between off-task and on-task performance was markedly more pronounced from mind wandering without meta-awareness. All right, let me just, there's a lot of other studies that I could have told you about with respect to mind wandering. Let me just tell you, do a little hand waving at a few of them. One recent study that came out in Psychological Science involved looking at eye movements. And so in this study, we had them read Sense and Sensibility, again, picking on the classics. And we had them attached to an eye tracker. And there's some very interesting research on eye tracking, as many of you may know, with respect to reading, in which when people are reading, their eyes do not fixate equally on all words, but rather they fixate longer on those words that are either low familiarity or longer words. They also fixate longer at the end of a sentence, something that's known as a wrap-up. And basically what this suggests is that the mind is processing, requires more time to process some words than others, and that's reflected in gaze durations. So we can ask the question, well, what happens when people are mind-wandering? Do they similarly show this differential pattern, or do they show a behavior which is suggestive of them not really processing the material to the degree that, that they should be? And indeed, that's exactly what we found. We found that when people were mind-wandering, that there was much less discrimination between the high-frequency and the low-frequency words, that individuals' pattern of gaze durations were systematically different prior to those episodes in which they reported being on task and those episodes in which they reported to be mind-wandering. So we can actually begin to use eye tracking as a signature of whether or not people are attending to the material. We've also just recently gotten similar effects with the word-by-word paradigm, and the nice thing about that is that you just use the reaction times of a button press, so you don't need to have the expensive eye tracker. We've also looked at ERP. This was also using the SART. The P3 is an orienting response that individuals typically evidence when they see a new stimulus, and we found that there was a markedly reduced P3 associated with episodes prior to when people were engaging in the SART. If we probed them and we asked them just now, were you mind-wandering? And if they said yes, the P3 for the several trials prior to that was markedly reduced relative to when they said they were on task. And a similar pattern was observed when they made errors. So the P3, attenuated P3, seems to be another marker of mind-wandering. And then finally, I mentioned this before, we've used gibberish detection, where you have people reading the material, and periodically the text becomes gibberish, and we find that people are much less likely to notice gibberish when they're mind-wandering. We haven't done this yet. We also find that people reading aloud doesn't seem to reduce mind-wandering at all. So we're gearing up to do a study where we're going to have people reading out loud, and periodically the text will come to gibberish. And so it'll be fun to have these people sort of reading aloud stuff that makes absolutely no sense at all, as if they think it's making sense. So these are some of the indirect indices. What I hope I've persuaded you of is that we really have been able to sort of get an empirical handle on what would seem to be this elusive internal state. Oh, just one last point I just want to mention. We've done some interesting stuff on the relationship between mind-wandering and mindfulness. There's been sort of increasing interest as of late in sort of the relationship between some sort of Buddhist concepts and cognitive psychology. And one of those is this notion of mindfulness, the notion of being present in the here and now. And we've looked at the relationship, and there are a number of scales of mindfulness that have been created. And basically what we found is that indeed mindfulness does seem to be the opposite of mind wandering. So people who score high on mindfulness scales mind wander less. And then we've also, I'm going to rush through these, so I'm not going to show you this data, so I'll just do some hand waving at it. But we also find that if you have people engage in a very simple activity of simply focusing on their breath for 10 minutes prior to engaging in the SART task, that they make fewer errors. So it seems that even a brief mindfulness training can lead to enhanced focus and reduced mind wandering. So it's a very sort of exciting prospect that training in mindfulness may be one way to circumvent the problems of mind wandering. Okay, so I'm going to skip these slides here. Okay, so in summary, with respect to this easy problems of consciousness, a focus on the internal mental states reveals the importance of mind wandering, that they're frequent, that they're amenable to research, and that they're a major source of errors. Assessment of meta-awareness reveals people regularly lose track of the contents of their own minds. And the process of triangulation between self-reports, behavior, and neurocognitive markers elucidates the internal states of mind wandering. Okay. So with that, let me just take a couple of minutes and go into the sort of fringe here and talk about the hard problem of consciousness. So assume for the moment that we worked out a perfect mapping between brain activation and mental states, that we could perfectly predict what people report. So, I'm able to sort of stick something in your head and I go, okay, I know right now you're thinking about a hot turkey sandwich, and I know exactly what you're experiencing at any moment and I'm perfectly able to sort of anticipate your conscious experiences from one moment to the next. Would we have solved the hard problem of consciousness? Would we now understand consciousness? I mean, we know that you're conscious now. We know that you're not conscious then. We know what you're thinking about. And I would argue, no, we have not explained it because we would not have explained how it is that consciousness rises. Why are self-reports associated with inner experience of consciousness at all? In David Chalmers' terms, you could be a zombie. You could still be processing the information, but why is it that you actually have qualia at all? And that's really it's really a fundamental question. Now, let's take this question from the perspective of the inside out and ask it this way. From an internal perspective, what is it that you know for certain? What do you know for absolute certain? And of course, if you think about what answer Descartes came to when he asked this question, the fundamental thing that you realize when you consider your own experience is the fact that you are engaging in subjective experience, right? You could be dreaming right now. You could be a brain in a vat. You could be in the matrix. This whole thing could be just your dream. Even still, under any scenario you come up with, you are having an experience. So really, experience is absolutely one of the absolutely most fundamental things that you know. The other thing I'd like to argue that is equally fundamental is the flow of time. What is experience? Experience is defined by change, and change requires a flow of time. So to talk about having an experience means that there has to be at least a little bit of experience, of change in time that's taking place. Now, philosophically speaking, it's possible that you could be stuck in a really nasty loop. It could be that all the past is just an illusion, and you're not actually going anywhere, that we're just looping in this little moment together here, all of us, thinking that we have a memory of the past. But even still, even if we're just stuck in a little loop, there's that little moment of experience right now that we're having that involves some flow of time. So there are really two things that we know with absolute certainty, that experience occurs and that there is at least some flow of time. Everything else, ultimately, is less certain than that. Physical reality, you could just be dreaming, I mean, philosophically speaking. And certainly there are times in every day in which you think you're awake and you're just dreaming. And this is I don't personally believe this, but this is a whole solipsistic argument. Other minds might not exist. You all could be zombies. I give you the benefit of the doubt. Each one of you has to give me the benefit of the doubt in the same way. But just because solipsism and egocentrism are distasteful does not make them logically impossible. So logically speaking, nothing is as certain as the fact that you are having an experience and that you are in at least participating in a moment of time. Now, what does the prevailing paradigm tell us? Well, it turns out that the two things that we know with absolute fundamental certainty, the two things which we have to take as the rock-solid thing that cannot be questioned, prevailing view has no explanation for. So the prevailing view, there's absolutely no explanation for how it is that subjective experience arises. And the flow of time is treated as an illusion. So Einstein said, the past, the present, the future are all illusions, even if stubborn ones. And the physicist Paul Davies observes, nothing other than a conscious observer registers the flow of time. So herein lies the rub. And I think that this is really a big deal. And it sort of troubles me that no one else seems bothered by this. The two things of which I am most certain, experience and the flow of time, are entirely dependent on the existence of an observer, consciousness, and current views provide no way, currently, of conceptualizing them. So I think this is really, there's something wrong here, right? How can you have the two things that you know best be entirely swept under the rug by the prevailing view? So what might we do to try to restore these two absolutely fundamental things? Okay, so here's where I really go off the deep end, and I introduce these things not to say that they're necessarily the case, but rather to sort of expand people's thinking about the kinds of issues that ultimately we as scientists need to confront, and perhaps the kinds of speculations that might be worthy of considering in such an endeavor. So David Chalmers, a renowned philosopher, at least in some circles, has argued that on similar grounds that perhaps consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the nature of reality. He says, I propose that conscious experience be considered fundamental feature, irreducible to anything more basic. If existing fundamental theories cannot encompass it, then something new is required. And he's not alone in this. Other physicists have also made similar speculations. Now let's talk about the problem of time. As I mentioned before, physics offers no account for the flow of time. As the theoretical physicist Paul Davies said, nothing in known physics corresponds to the passage of time. Indeed, physicists insist that time doesn't flow at all, it merely is. Now, some of you may have heard that there is an explanation for the direction of time, that entropy, you can tell sort of what of two moments in time is later by virtue of the fact that entropy, there's more entropy at the later moment than at the earlier moment. But that's only a partial explanation. That's simply an explanation for something that provides a direction to the arrow of time. It doesn't actually explain what's flowing, what the flow of time is. And that's because the way physicists think about time, here we have what's known as a block universe. That's the Big Bang, the very back there, and then we have this sort of gradual condensation into stars, and then finally we have the sun here, and then the Earth going around it, and I guess eventually it's all going to, I guess this is where they think it's going. But the point is that what physicists speculate, the way physicists think about time, and this is follows out of relativity theory, where you think about time as just another spatial dimension, that right now we have a vector in 3 coordinates of space and 1 coordinate of time, and each moment is just another location in this block universe. That's all well and good, but in that case, what's moving through the block universe? In fact, you can't have movement. There's not enough degrees of freedom to have movement. We're fixed. We're missing a degree of freedom, seems to be the conclusion that I find to be hard to get around. So that's where I get even further out there by suggesting that perhaps consciousness is taking advantage of an additional dimension of reality that is what allows us to move through the block universe. And again, I'm not the only one who speculated about this. Well, you can see this. You can see how this problem arises from what Paul Davies says. He says, "But what meaning can be attached to the movement of time itself? Relative to what does it move? Whereas other types of motion relate to one physical process to another, the putative flow of time relates time to itself, posing the simple question, how fast does time pass, exposes the absurdity of the very idea. The trivial answer is 1 second per second tells us nothing at all." So this is, from the standard view, we're stuck in this place where the flow of time really doesn't even make any sense. Again, I think that an independent dimension of subjective reality could accommodate this by providing the additional dimension, the additional degree of freedom necessary. And again, this is something that other physicists have speculated about. Andre Linde, a renowned physicist, said, "Is it possible that consciousness, like space-time, has its own intrinsic degree of freedom, and that neglecting these will lead to a description of the universe that is fundamentally incomplete?" So perhaps experience corresponds to an additional dimension of subjective time that provides the degree of freedom necessary to enable consciousness to move through physical time. In other words, when you take an inside-out perspective and consider what you really know, what you realize is that there are some absolutely glaringly, fundamentally unexplained things in our current account of the nature of reality. And this then leads us to consider the possibility that something additional may be required. And I think it's worth considering that given how significant consciousness is, and given that we can't understand either consciousness or the flow of time currently, that perhaps the suggestion of additional degree of freedom associated with subjectivity may be required to accommodate it. All right, so general conclusions. Standard approaches have considered the mind from the outside, leading to easy problems such as overlooked internal mental states, such as introspection and mind wandering, and hard problems such as no way of accounting for consciousness or the flow of time. Considering consciousness from the inside out is helpful in that both with respect to these easy problems, in that it elucidates the importance and tractability of mind wandering and reveals how often we lack meta-awareness of our mental states, and also suggests some possible ways of addressing the hard problem, such as the possibility that consciousness may be a fundamental aspect of reality, and then an additional subjective additional of time might fit the bill as a way of thinking about what this additional component is that we need to posit to accommodate the flow of time and subjective experience. Thank you very much. Laura.
So, I mean, people's mind wandering happens an awful lot, apparently. And generally, I guess, it makes sense to think that that's problematic, but if they're doing it so much, I mean, it seems like our minds kind of have a mind of its own. Right? You know what I mean? So what accounts for the commonality of it? It can't be completely dysfunctional. I mean, apparently that's what our minds want to do, even if we don't want them to do it, and I don't even know who we are.
Yeah. So the question is, if mind wandering is so dysfunctional, why do we do it so much? And surely there must be some functionality to it. And this is actually a really interesting topic and one that we've now taken on as one of the primary areas of research in the lab. I think that there are a number of useful functions to mind wandering. One is that it serves as an opportunity for planning. When the current situation is not that demanding, we find we're able to leave the moment and consider what we're going to be doing in the future. And we have a lot of research now which suggests that a large proportion of mind wandering involves planning and future thought, and that's the resource demanding kind of mind wandering. So I already showed you some evidence of activation of the executive network. When you put people under more demanding tasks, it reduces mind wandering, but especially reduces this future thinking kind of mind wandering. So that seems to be one useful thing. The second thing is it seems to be a major source of creativity. And this may be even one of the reasons why some people mind wander so much. We find that there's correlations between mind wandering and creative performance. And we also find that it's especially useful. We've got a study now looking at incubation. So we give people creativity problems. We then give them a task, and we measure the frequency of mind wandering. And then we give them the problem again. We find that those individuals who engage in mind wandering during the incubation period are more likely to show the biggest benefit of incubation. But interestingly, it's not simply that they're mind wandering about the problem. They actually don't report mind wandering about the problem. So it may be that mind wandering also allows this sort of unconscious associative processing, which really is useful. And the last thing that's interesting there is we actually had 3 conditions. We gave them nothing to do, we gave them a mildly demanding task to do, and we gave them a very demanding task to do. And it was in the mildly demanding task, which is when you have what we would call the quintessential mind wandering, that we got the biggest incubation effects. So there really does seem to be some adaptive characteristics to mind wandering with respect to creativity, also with respect to planning. And so it's a real balancing act between, on the one hand, being present when you need to be, and on the other hand, letting the mind travel when it can. Let's see. Nelson.
Well, it seems to me that when you address the easy problem, you're on the level of meta-awareness, and when you address the hard problem, you may be more on the level of fundamental consciousness, and not the meta-awareness so much. So I guess my question is, I wonder whether there's a way to bridge those and look at easier solutions or easier neural correlates to the fundamental consciousness, such as looking at people who continue to do activity while they're having an epileptic attack where it's pretty clear that they had no memory of it later and they're probably not conscious during it. In other words, neural correlates not just of meta-awareness, but of actual awareness, anosognosia, all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think one of the really promising neural correlates of experiential consciousness is this synchrony, the gamma synchrony, which seems to show up in a lot of different situations. And there's some really intriguing things about gamma synchrony where they find that one area of the brain can become synchronized with another area of the brain at a rate that's faster than actually can be explained through neural transduction, which again raises the, if there were, and again I recognize this as really radical conjecture, but if there were some other dimension by which consciousness is traverses, that might explain why you get these kinds of patterns. But I think the idea of finding measures that are robust measures of experiential consciousness of that sort is really going to be a critical part to the solution. Yes?
Oh, I had a two-part question. One is a follow-up to Laura's. I was thinking when you were comparing mind wandering while reading and mind wandering while driving, I was thinking of an intermediate case, which is mind wandering while listening to, say, a string quartet. You're in a concert hall or a symphony or a piece of music with that's sung in a language that you don't understand. So I find my mental state when I'm in that kind of situation, there's a lot of wandering, but it's this wonderful sort of background for meditation, and it's just that kind of case seems to maybe provide some illustrations of the usefulness of mind wandering.
Mm-hmm.
And another question is, let me stop there and just say if you what you would say about intermediate cases like that. Or,
yeah, I think that this may be one of the reasons why we may enjoy music is because it gives us an opportunity to indulge in a mind wandering that's not the problematic kind, but still is occupying us enough so that we get this sort of, remember I mentioned that the biggest benefits were when people have some activity that they're engaging in. So there's a certain sort of modestly demanding activity that I think may really encourage the useful kind of daydreaming. Another example would be, taking a shower. I mean, how many ideas do people have in the showers? Walks, seem to be a really a very, very just demanding enough to sort of keep the mind sort of active and you're still allowing those types of things. So I think that music, of course, there's some people who really listen very deeply to it, but I think that music really does afford an ideal context to have the most productive kinds of mind wandering. One other thing on productive mind wandering, if you've seen this Gilbert paper, it basically says something like, I don't know, the wandering mind, the human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind, and it basically is just sort of really anti mind wandering, basically the argument is that every time they caught people mind wandering, they were at a minimum no happier than when they were on task, and typically less happy. And a couple of thoughts about that is one, that sometimes we have to mind wander about difficult things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not productive. So if you have a problem to solve, it may be unpleasant to solve it, but still it's a useful thing to do. Second thing is that their study seems to have confounded mind wandering with just sort of negative rumination, and that much of that may not sort of fit into sort of the more productive kind of mind wandering. And the third thing is that I think it's really a useful activity to find topics to mind wander about. I think as academics, we may be sort of blessed with having really good material for mind wandering. But that I think that this is really a useful activity for people to engage in, to actually spend a little time thinking about things they enjoy thinking about so that they can put themselves in that small group of people who really have creative and enjoyable mind-wandering episodes. Yes?
I wanted to ask you about mindfulness. I was really excited to see you have that up there, that you've done some study on mindfulness. Basically as an intervention, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that it enhances the ability for meta-awareness, for self-directed meta-awareness. And I was wondering if you've thought about any correlation between mindfulness, not just as an intervention, but as, you know, as being a kind of methodology and sort of a way of accessing phenomenological experience. Because, you know, I tried to get down that synergy, not because it was a good one, and I did get it all down, but about perhaps experience corresponding to an additional, whatever, dimension of subjective time and that leading to freedom and all that, which is basically what Buddhist doctrine is, right? I mean, that process of bringing the mind back, bringing the mind back, bringing the mind back is how, in fact, we are in touch with experience, with present moment experience, and thus that is what brings freedom. And so, anyway, I just wondered if there was any work on that.
Well, a couple of things. I think in terms of this, I mentioned briefly that there's this sort of increasing dialogue between psychologists and Buddhists, and I think that dialogue needs to be expanded further. And in fact, we just got a major grant from the Office of Education, and I'm really excited that one of the key players in the grant is actually a Lama who's had 6 years of silent retreat, and who is does as an ongoing teaches, and he's going to be teaching students, but he's also a collaborator in it. And the reason why I think this is so important is that the technique of contemplative practices has given people a lot of opportunity to sort of sharpen their meta-awareness, basically, about what the nature of experience is. And so it's not simply a matter of preventing people from mind wandering, it's also a matter that they have developed Alan Wallace thinks of it as like a telescope, or a tool for getting insight into the nature of fundamental experience. Alan Wallace also is in Santa Barbara. I don't know if many of you know him. He's got a wonderful book called Hidden Dimensions, which espouses a thesis very similar to the one that you're talking about. So we've been in dialogue with him, so I'm very much enthusiastic about using contemplatives not just as guinea pigs, not just as instructors to teach people to do basic meditation, but as individuals who can offer insight into some of the basic qualities of subjective experience. Yes?
Going back to your neuroimaging findings where executive areas were recruited during instances of mind wandering, the reason that you suggested was potentially that when they're mind wandering, they're forming plans like going to hang out with their friends, and that's a lot of what you find in Mike Keene's research, that they're often thinking about what they're going to do after they're done with this task. Is it also possible that as a potential alternative explanation that perhaps the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is being recruited because it's either some type of goal maintenance to get people sort of back on track to the task at hand, or perhaps even sort of a strategic allocation to take some time away from the task to mind wander so they can come back to the task and have it be fresh?
Yeah, I think that the possibility that part of this entails some sort of self-regulation process where they're trying to bring themselves back is certainly viable. Kane seems to suggest that that mind wandering is sort of a function of a deficit in working memory capacity, and we have evidence suggesting that in a number of different situations, higher working capacity is associated with a greater mind wander. You also, for example, find that with aging, people mind wander less, not more, which is also inconsistent with the notion that mind wandering is simply the product of a deficit in working memory or executive capacities. But that said, I do think that it's possible that some portion of that activation could be due to efforts to bring the mind back. Yes?
I was curious, in the beginning, when you talked about the easy problem, you said that one reason for this is that as a field we focus a lot from third-person perspective and maybe are too skeptical about people's introspection and self-reports. And I think you could argue, at least in some sub-areas of the field, the opposite is true, that people have too much faith in self-reports and we don't often corroborate due to triangulation and so on. Do you think that's a difference between areas? Some topics, researchers are too happy to just rely on self-reports, and some topics...
Which areas are you talking about?
I mean, I can think of specific constructs where we use self-reports that don't think that would be the best measure, morality or the objective functioning, psychological well-being stuff.
Well, I I think that, I mean, certainly cognitive psychology has suffered from this problem of the third person perspective. But I do think, as I said, I'm walking a tightrope here, and I'm not just espousing, just sort of taking anything that anybody says on face validity. And I think that really the technique is the convergence of using triangulation between self-reports and behavioral neurocognitive measures and showing that they all line up. And I think mind wandering really provides a nice example of that. I think we have to be cautious in those situations where you can't figure out the measures, and there are likely situations where psychology continues to make the error of excessively relying on self-reports in ways that are not necessarily valid. And indeed, much of my earlier work has pointed out the challenges with self-reports. Let's see. Yes?
You said earlier that we cannot follow two train of thoughts simultaneously. So what do you think about multitasking? For example, something like driving is considered like automatic. So driving while texting or texting while driving. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, so I think that basically, well, first off, one thing to point out is that mind wandering was the original multitasking, right? That we've been doing mind wandering is multitasking for a long time. I think the way that people multitask is because there are two different ways that you can multitask. Either one of the two things that you're doing is already automatized, and so you're basically just doing the automatized thing with the additional task. The problem with driving is that it's largely but not entirely automatized. So as long as there's not many demands, it's fine, but there are periodically episodes where you need very quick access to full executive functioning. And if you're texting during one of those moments, that's where a lot of problems arise. So I think that that's one of the reasons why texting is so problematic. And then the other thing is that the other way that you can multitask is through serial. So you do one thing and then back and forth like that. So in that way you can carry on, seemingly carry on. For example, in a conversation, you could be listening to the person and then having your own thoughts and then coming back. And the way that you're succeeding at that is by alternating attention back and forth between the two domains. Yeah?
So in the mind wandering research, it seems what I did is like you want to stop mind wandering so that the original task is more focused. But is it possible to train multitasking?
So that notice that when people mind wander and they're meta-aware of the fact that they're mind wandering, it's much less problematic. And so one of the things that we're trying to do right now is to develop techniques where through using the response methodology, basically alerting people to when they're mind wandering so that they can ideally become more aware when they're doing it themselves. And I think that if people had sufficient meta-awareness of their mind wandering, that they would be able to mind wander at times that would be less problematic. So I think there are ways through introducing and refining meta-awareness to enable people to minimize the disruptive effects of mind wandering. Let me switch to this side of the room. Yeah?
I was wondering, as you seem to you do follow Chalmers in sorting out these problems into the easy camp and the hard camp. And I take it that you want to put the explanation of meta-awareness in the easy camp. Is that right?
Yeah.
I wonder why. I wonder why you think meta-awareness is fundamentally tractable. We can give an explanation of it, but not phenomenal consciousness or awareness is in this more basic sense. It didn't seem that we were getting from your talk a particularly detailed mechanistic account of meta-awareness. You've got some interesting studies, you've got some MRI stuff, it's all very interesting, but there isn't a detailed story there. I was just wondering if you could say why you think we're going to get that story, but we're not going to get a story that's anything remotely as good in the case of this more fundamental kind of awareness.
So a zombie could either have meta-awareness or not, and you could look at the measure the meta-awareness of a zombie and begin to differentiate, the times in which it was meta-aware and not meta-aware using the self-caught and the probe-caught, and start to sort of triangulate on the conditions in which it was meta-aware versus not. Whereas the whole point of a zombie is that you would never be able to know if it was subjective, it was conscious or not, because the consciousness involves this first-person ontology that's not accessible to a third-person observer. So that's really the problem is that meta-awareness lends itself to a kind of measurement that qualia does not.
So meta-awareness is just self-report. I mean, if it's meta-awareness, I mean, people can be making these verbal reports, but they needn't necessarily be expressive of genuine awareness.
Meta-awareness is... That's true.
Otherwise, why use that term?
Yeah, that's true. Meta-awareness is a kind of awareness. So I can solve the meta part of the meta-awareness thing, but it's true. You still can't solve the experiential part. But that's the whole other aspect. So yes, meta-awareness is there's a aspect to meta-awareness that cannot be that is the hard problem, which is the qualia part of meta-awareness. But the informational part of meta-awareness with respect to the situations in which the system is able to report on what information it has access to in the times in which it doesn't, that part is more attractive.
So meta-awareness is actually partly easy, partly hard.
Okay.
It's not really easy across the board, right?
Well, in the sense that everything is partly, yes, okay. I'll concede that, yeah. Yeah, Ken.
More on the hard problem. It seemed like, so the hard problem is you can't explain how qualia arrived, how you get that out of the brain. I wasn't sure how the notion about a separate dimension of time, subjective time, really explains the qualia.
Sure. Basically, the idea is rather than to try to explain subjective experience and time, that we should take those as axiomatic. That we should start with those as axioms because they are the absolute fundamentals. And so once you take subjectivity as an axiom, you no longer need to explain it, but you need to say what it is or how it fits in. And so that's what this is. It's an effort to, in the spirit of Chalmers, where he says it's a fundamental aspect of the universe, but doesn't say what that fundamental aspect is. I'm saying the fundamental thing that it is a corresponding to some sort of additional dimension in which we are moving through information space. Yeah.
Can you clarify what you think's happening when people self-catch themselves? Are they saying, I just have been mind wandering and now I've come back? Or do you think they're actually mind wandering while they're reporting? Is it a past? It's a very important distinction because your claim is that you're aware that you're mind wandering, and you could say, well, they just mind wandered less, and now they've come back and they're aware they had mind wandered, and there's no awareness while mind wandering.
Yeah, that's a very nuanced question. What I think happens is that, and when we look at the eye tracking data prior to the self-reports, we see that there's a moment or two before they actually press the button where they're not even looking at the screen, they're sort of looking off. And I think that what happens is that was when the moment was where they actually went, oh geez, there I go, I did it again. And then after that, they then bring themselves back and tell us that they were mind wandering. And in a sense, the fact, and this is almost a definitional thing, the fact that they are now engaging in the task of telling us that they were mind wandering suggests that they are now back in the present and engaging us. But I think the initial moment of meta-awareness was prior to them pressing the button, and that was sort of this gradual, or I say gradual in the sense of transitional switch to coming back to reality. Yes, absolutely. That's what the. That's right. That's what the. That's what seems to be going on when we ask people retrospectively. Did you know that you were mind wandering? Remember in the PNAS paper, when they knew that they were mind wandering, they showed much less distinct brain activation, suggesting that there's this. You know you're mind wandering while you're doing it, but you may not be mind wandering in as deep a way as when you're mind wandering. You don't. The deepest kind of the most dissociated, we have another word, decoupled, the most decoupled kind of mind wandering is when you don't even know that you're doing it.
Maybe one more question, and then I think we have
Let's
to
see. Yeah.
wrap it up.
So, if you consider mind wandering as a kind of a state, mental state, then if we use the distinction state and trait, maybe absent-mindedness will be the trait of people that do lots of mind wandering. Mm-hmm. Now, with absent-mindedness people, there's lots of studies showing that, for example, they have poor perspective memory because they don't pay attention, kind of online things. And so this, I'm not sure how this fits, kind of you're mentioning that actually high working memory people tend to wander more, mind wander more, because it seems like actually if you don't pay attention, you have mind wandering, you won't be able. And likewise, maybe even with retrospective memory, if you don't pay attention to the information, I mean, your studies with comprehension, you can translate this into memory result. So I would expect actually negative correlation both for retrospective and prospective memory. So how it fits really with the high working memory people?
I perhaps mistook. People with high working memory capacity will mind wander more under certain situations. That is, when you give them a non-demanding task to engage in, where they basically have the sufficient resources to be able to carry on the task without it undermining their performance. And for sure, in general, it's basically a balancing act. It's basically if you were to look at academics, who I think are arguably a reasonably accomplished group, they probably are more absent-minded than the average person. And so they've managed to sort of balance their penchant for engaging in their head in the clouds with navigating everyday life. And I guess there was that academic who left his kid in the car. So terrible things do happen as a result of that, but they managed to get by. So it's not a simple sort of pie kind of situation where the more you basically it's a complex situation. There are trade-offs to daydreaming and to being on task, and I think that there are certain strategies that individuals can employ, particularly involving honing their meta-awareness to be able to enable them to be mind-wandering at appropriate times and not at inappropriate times, that can allow for people to simultaneously engage in a rich mind-wandering life while still maintaining the important material from their day-to-day lives.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.